This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. We have an excellent one for you, episode 359, entitled, How Powerful Was the Promised Messiah Expected to Be? So far too often, opponents of the biblical Unitarian position see Jesus do things in the New Testament Gospels that sound like things that only God can do. And they conclude, based on this evidence alone, that Jesus must be the one true God. These interpreters will say that Jesus is talking about things that God says in the Old Testament. Jesus is performing miracles that God did in the Old Testament, and Jesus even bears the titles that God has in the Old Testament. And these arguments go on and on. Jesus basically looks like the God of the Old Testament based on a variety of passages. And for these interpreters, the only way that you can make sense of person B doing the things of person A is to assume that person B just is person A. Unfortunately, the Jewish principle of agency, where the agent fully represents the one who sends him, is rarely considered at all. So this week's episode is going to look at 6 Old Testament passages to understand just how powerful the Messiah was expected to be. We will set the expectation for what Jesus Christ could reasonably do as an anointed human being in the 4 New Testament Gospel accounts, strictly based on what the Jews anticipated that their promised anointed king would actually be empowered to do. So, what can we learn about the sort of Messiah that Jews expected based solely on the Old Testament? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is promises of the anticipated Jewish Messiah and his powers. So, first place we're going to look at is Psalm 8. And I'll be reading the passage fairly quickly, and then we'll spend the time talking about the anticipated empowerments of the Messiah through each of these passages. So, Psalm 8, we'll read it in its entirety. O Yahweh our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, who has displayed your splendor above the heavens. From the mouth of infants and nursing babes, you have established strength because of your adversaries, to make the enemy and the revengeful cease. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. All sheep and oxen, and the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. O Yahweh our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. It's Psalm 8, verses 1 through 9. So, this passage, of course, is drawing on Genesis chapter 1 and reflecting on Adam and his position as the human being that was made in God's image and was made to rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every creeping thing on the earth. And it is reflecting on the ideal rule of Adam, who was supposed to be the human king over all the earth. And so readers of this would, of course, be thinking about a human ruler and what a human ruler could possibly achieve based on this ideal that we see of Adam in Genesis chapter 1. And they would look forward to the expected human ruler in Jewish theology, namely the promised Messiah. And so several New Testament passages will draw upon Psalm 8 in order to describe Jesus Christ, particularly as the Jewish Messiah. So there's an ideal reign that the Messiah is going to partake in. But what's interesting is that this human figure is crowned with God's own glory and God's own majesty. So the human being is going to bear God's prerogatives and his attributes. He's going to bear God's glory and he's going to bear God's majesty. God is sharing his glory and majesty with this highly qualified human ruler. And we're also seeing that this human being is put in charge of all of God's creation, thereby regaining the dominion of Adam. So those are several really important aspects of what we would call the job description of the Jewish Messiah based out of Psalm 8. Let's look at our next passage. The next passage will be Psalm 45. This is a little lengthier, but there are several aspects of this psalm that describe the idealized Israelite king, which of course came to be understood as the Messiah. This original passage was probably referring to Solomon or Hezekiah. It was definitely one of the kings that was married and had a wife, which of course is not literally applying to Jesus. It originally had an Old Testament referent. So let's begin. Psalm 45, verse 1. My heart overflows with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. You are fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your majesty. And in your majesty, ride on victoriously. For the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness, let your right hand teach you awesome things. Your arrows are sharp. The peoples fall under you. Your arrows are in the heart of the king's enemies. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. All your garments are fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. Out of ivory palaces, stringed instruments have made you glad. King's daughters are among your noble ladies. At your right hand stands the queen in gold from Ophir. Listen, O daughter, give attention and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, then the king will desire your beauty. Because he is your Lord, bow down to him. The daughters of Tyre will come with a gift. The rich among the people will seek your favor. The king's daughter is all glorious within. Her clothing is interwoven with gold. She will be led to the king in embroidered work. The virgins, her companions, who follow her, will be brought to you. They'll be led forth with gladness and rejoicing. They will enter into the king's palace. In place of your fathers will be your sons. You shall make them princes in all the earth. I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore, the peoples will give you thanks forever and ever. That's Psalm 45, verses 1 through 17. And there are several really important things that are being said here about a human king, the idealized Israelite human king. First of all, we see that he is someone who is blessed by God, and he is blessed by God in some very specific ways. One way that this human king is blessed by God is that he actually has received two of God's prerogatives. He bears God's splendor, and he bears God's majesty. One of those we've already seen in Psalm 8, but in other passages we could see that splendor and majesty are actually God's attributes. But here, they have been given to this human king. And not only is this human king the recipient of God's blessing and God's splendor and God's majesty, he also is the recipient of God's own title. He's actually called God in Psalm 45, verse 6. Now, some people have tried to argue against this and to say that the noun Elohim is actually functioning as an adjective to describe the throne, as in your divine throne. The problem with this, though, is that it is perfectly fine to describe God here as a noun, as Elohim is used as a noun in verse 7. It doesn't make sense that it would be an adjective in verse 6 and then change to a noun in verse 7. But also, what gets left out is the discussion of verse 7. Let me read this again. You, the king, you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. There are two references to God here in verse 7. The second one clearly is your God who has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. But the first one seems to describe again the king with the vocative. Therefore, O God, namely the king, your God has anointed you. It's not a double reference to the God who anointed the king. It's not saying, God, your God. That's not what is actually being said there. This is a reference in verse 7, which is clearly again addressing the king, the human Israelite king, as God. So if someone wants to make the argument that the throne is divine, you can't make that argument in verse 7. Verse 7 is saying, therefore, O king, who bears the title God, your God has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. So I don't actually think that the argument for the throne being described as divine is the best reading of the text. We have the references to God and every other occurrence which functions as a noun, so it's very unlikely that it's going to refer to an adjective in verse 6. And it seems that the people that want to make this argument seem to be less inclined with God sharing his own title with human beings, even though God clearly did this with Moses in Exodus chapter 4 and chapter 7, and with human judges in Exodus 21 and Exodus 22. So God sharing his title with the human king is not a surprise here. So that's just part of the way in which Yahweh is blessing this human king. And even other human beings are going to address this king as a human superior. The wife, the bride, is describing this human king as your Lord. This is the word Adon, which is the common word for Lord or Master. It's not Adonai, which is the word for Yahweh. It's Yahweh's lordship word, which is never used and applied to a human being, or to Jesus for that matter. This is just your Lord. So the king can be described with this exalted title. And not only is he described with an exalted title, he's actually worshipped. People are bowing down to this human being. And there's no sense in which monotheism is under attack. Nobody is thinking that the people are blaspheming by worshiping a human being. It's something that God allows, because God has highly empowered and highly authorized this important human ruler who is ruling on his behalf. And then at the end of the psalm, we see that people are giving this human king thanks. They are offering their own thanksgiving to a man, to a human being, a member of the human race. And again, all of these things are ways in which God is empowering and authorizing a human being, particularly a human ruler. And of course, the New Testament is going to draw upon Psalm 45 in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8 and 9. So that's Psalm 45. There's a lot there. Let's look at Psalm 72, starting in verse 1. Give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness, and your afflicted with justice. Let the mountains bring peace to the people, and the hills in righteousness. May he vindicate the afflicted of the people, save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. Let them fear you while the sun endures, as long as the moon throughout all generations. May he come down like rain upon the mown grass, like showers that water the earth, In his days may the righteous flourish, and abundance of peace till the moon is no more. May he also rule from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Let the nomads of the desert bow before him, and his enemies lick the dust. Let the kings of Tarshish and of the islands bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts. And let all the kings bow down before him, all the nations serve him. For he will deliver the needy when he cries for help, the afflicted also, and him who has no helper. He will have compassion on the poor and the needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. He will rescue their life from oppression and violence, and their blood will be precious in his sight. So may he live, and may the gold of Sheba be given to him, and let them pray for him continually. Let them bless him all day long. May there be an abundance of grain in the earth. On top of the mountains, its fruit will wave like the cedars of Lebanon, and may those from the city flourish like vegetation of the earth. May his name endure forever. May his name endure before the sun. And let men bless themselves by him. Let all the nations call him blessed. Blessed be Yahweh God, the God of Israel, who alone works wonders. And blessed be his glorious name forever. And may the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen and amen. That's Psalm 72. All the verses 1 through 19. And again, we have several instances here to where Yahweh is sharing his own privileges and prerogatives with the human king. First thing we see is that God is sharing the prerogative to be the divine judge with this human ruler. That's in the first two verses. And so the king is basically going to judge the people as God's agent. The king is exercising justice and casting out judgments, and he is actually bearing the judgments of God and issuing them as God's human agent. As God's agent, he's also able to vindicate and to save. So the king is going to be a savior figure. We also see that he's going to rule the entire world. He's not just ruling from Jerusalem. He's not just ruling on Mount Zion. He is ruling from sea to sea, and his dominion is going to extend all the way to the ends of the earth. The idealized picture of the Jewish Messiah was, again, not just to rule in Jerusalem, in Israel, but his rule was to extend over all of creation. And this, of course, is making him bring back the dominion that was originally promised to Adam. There's an interesting word in 72 verse 9, which in the translation that I read, it says, let the nomads of the desert bow before him. But this word for nomad is a rare word, the word see, and it's used less than 10 times in the entire Old Testament. But in other places, it's very clearly not referring to human nomads, but actually to a kind of animal, often an animal that is in the desert. And so some translations have said this actually is a reference to animals. Let the animals come and worship this human king. And this suggests that this king is going to possess authority over the animals, not unlike King Adam, who was ruling over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all of the creeping things on the earth. So it's an interesting point. Now, this passage doesn't have to be translated that way in order for that to be true. We already saw that in Psalm 8. Another interesting passage is verse 17, which says, may his name endure before the sun. And in Hebrew, we have the preposition lifnei, and then shemesh, which is the word for the sun. This is S-U-N, as in that big glowing ball in the air that gives us light and heat. And so this passage is kind of praying and saying, may his name endure before the sun. But the word before, as it is in English, could mean before in time, or could mean before like in the presence of. And what's interesting is that several of the Jewish rabbis that we can see in the Babylonian Talmud and in the Jewish work Genesis Rabbah, they would take this passage, Psalm 72, verse 17, as proof that the Messiah's name pre-existed the creation of the Son. And again, Son is S-U-N. So they would read this as his name endured prior to the big ball in the sky, the sun. And so they would read this passage as referencing the preexistence of the human king's name. Not the human king as a personal being, not a conscious preexistence, but a preexistence in God's mind, that God knew the name of the Messiah prior to the creation of the Son. This is not my reading, even though I think it's likely. This is the reading of several Jews even after the New Testament period. They would talk about the preexistence of the Messiah's name, and they would point to Psalm 72, verse 17, and they would read it this way. I think it has a lot to commend itself of that reading. Let's look at our next psalm, Psalm 89. And there's no way we're going to be able to read all of this. We'll just read down to verse 27, because we got to get the sense as to what God is able to do and how God is going to share it with the son of David, to whom he has covenanted the throne and the dynasty and the kingdom forever. Let's start in verse 1. I will sing of the loving kindness of Yahweh forever. To all generations I will make known your faithfulness with my mouth. For I have said, loving kindness will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness. I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to David, my servant. I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. Selah. The heavens will praise your works, O Yahweh, your faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies is comparable to Yahweh? Who among the sons of the mighty is like Yahweh? A God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him. O Yahweh, God of hosts, who is like you, Almighty Yahweh? Your faithfulness also surrounds you. You rule the swelling of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You yourself crushed Rahab like the one who is slain. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours. The earth also is yours. The world and all that it contains, you have founded them. The north and the south, you have created them. Tabor and Hermon, shout for joy at your name. You have a strong arm. Your hand is mighty. Your right hand is exalted. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Loving kindness and truth go before you. How blessed are the people who know the thankful, joyful sound. O Yahweh, they walk in the light of your countenance. In your name they rejoice all day, and by your righteousness they are exalted. For you are the glory of their strength, and by your favor our horn is exalted. For our shield belongs to Yahweh, and our King to the Holy One of Israel. Once you spoke in vision to your godly ones and said, I have given help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him, with whom my hand will be established. My arm also will strengthen him. The enemy will not deceive him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. But I shall crush his adversaries before him and strike those who hate him. My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him, and in my name his horn will be exalted. I shall also set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. He will cry to me, You are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. I also shall make him firstborn, the highest of the kings of all the earth. That's Psalm 89, verses 1 through 27. And the psalm goes on for a little while longer, but I think we get the point as to what God is doing here. God is reaffirming his commitment to the Davidic covenant. And there's three things I want to pull out of this particular passage. Number one, God shares his strength with this promised Davidic king. God talks about how his arm is mighty, his right arm is mighty, but he is going to give his power and his strength to this promised Davidic king. So the king is going to be strengthened by being the beneficiary of God sharing his own might with a human being. Number two, God shares his control over the seas and the rivers and basically all of the chaotic waters with this human king. We saw that in verse 25 very clearly. I, Yahweh, will set his hand, the human being's hand, on the sea and his right hand on the rivers, indicating that he's going to have authority and control over the sea and the rivers, and these are the chaotic waters. We should expect that the Messiah is going to be able to do things like still the storms and walk on water. And he's not doing this because he's Yahweh. He's doing this because Yahweh has empowered him and shared Yahweh's own authority over creation with this human king. And of course, this human king is not just any king. He's going to be, the third point, the highest of the kings of all the earth. And of course, he describes God as the Father and my God. There's no confusing this Davidic king with Yahweh. The two are very clearly distinguished. Next passage we'll look at is Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 4, which says, As for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of old. Therefore, he will give them up until a time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. And he will arise and shepherd in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh, his God. That's Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. Now, Micah 5:2 is very familiar to many Christians. It gets talked about and preached during Advent every single year. And so we can see there that there's going to be a promised ruler who's going to come forth from Bethlehem. The importance of that is that Bethlehem was David's own hometown, so he's likened unto David. And he's going to come from Judah, which of course was David's own clan. So these are in fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. They're also in fulfillment of Genesis 49, verses 8 through 10, to where Israel has promised his son Judah that there's going to be a line of kings that are going to come forth from his own line. So we have the promises made to Judah and the promises made to David. Here we're seeing that there's going to be a ruler that's going to descend from Judah, and he's going to come forth from Bethlehem. He's going to be likened unto David in several important ways. He's also described as a shepherd, and David is basically the only shepherd king in the Old Testament. And what's interesting is that he is going to shepherd God's people in the strength of Yahweh. Verse 4, that's clear. He's going to have the strength of Yahweh because Yahweh is going to share his own strength with this human king. Now, we already saw this in Psalm 89, but here it gets repeated in Micah chapter 5. This is going to be a mighty human individual, but his might, which is the might of God, doesn't mean that he is God. It means that God has shared his own strength with this human king. And what also is interesting is that he is going to shepherd in the majesty of the name of Yahweh. He's going to share in God's own majesty, and he's going to share in God's own name. He's going to be ruling and functioning as a king with the name of Yahweh. It doesn't mean that he is Yahweh. It doesn't mean that he and Yahweh have been collapsed into a single being. No, it means that he is Yahweh's agent. He's doing things in the name of Yahweh. And just to make sure that we are clear that there's a distinction here, it's described as Yahweh, his God, indicating, of course, that the ruler coming from Bethlehem, of course, is a ruler who is not Yahweh. And the relationship between this ruler and Yahweh is that Yahweh is the God of this promised ruler that descends from Judah. So there's a lot to get out of Micah chapter 5. Last passage we'll look at is Zechariah chapter 12. In Zechariah 12, we'll look at verses 7 through 8. Yahweh also will save the tents of Judah first, so that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem will not be magnified above Judah. In that day, Yahweh will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one who is feeble among them in that day will be like David, and the house of David will be like God. The house of David will be like God. That's Zechariah chapter 12, verses 7 through 8. And yes, you heard it. We are seeing here that the promised Davidic Messiah is going to be likened unto God. It doesn't mean that he is God. It means he is going to be like God. Now, how is this possible? Well, we've seen that Yahweh is going to share his privileges, his prerogatives, his attributes, his own functions, his own name, his own title with this Davidic Messiah. So, of course, the Messiah is going to be like God. That doesn't mean that he is God. He's just likened unto God. And again, all these passages are in the Old Testament. So let's just kind of put everything together and let's draw some conclusions. I concluded everything, all the things we looked at, into 10 bullet points. The promised Jewish Messiah was not a mere man. He's not a mere mortal. He's not just some guy who is a creation. This was a very, very powerful Jewish Messiah who was expected to do several things. Number one, he was to regain the dominion promised to Adam, ruling over God's creation, including ruling over the animals, from the river to the ends of the earth. Number two, this human being is to be the beneficiary of Yahweh sharing his attributes with this king. The human being is to bear God's splendor, God's majesty, and God's glory. Number three, the human king is also empowered with God's own strength. He's able to do mighty and powerful works, not because he is Yahweh, but because Yahweh has empowered and strengthened him. Number four, this human king functions as the agent of Yahweh by ruling with Yahweh's name. God has shared his name with this human king, not that the two would be confused, but that this king would function as the agent of Yahweh. And number five, as Yahweh's agent, he also shares in the title of God. He's called that, arguably, in Psalm 45:6 and Psalm 45:7. Number six, he will be like God, as Zechariah chapter 12, verse 8 says. Not surprising, because Yahweh has shared his attributes, his strength, his own name, and his own title with this human ruler. Number seven, the human being is to receive worship, praise, and thanksgiving from other human beings without there being a compromise to monotheism and without any sort of suggestion that this human being receiving all of these great honors is blaspheming in any way. Number eight, the human being is going to share in Yahweh's authority over the chaotic waters. It should be no surprise when the human being is able to get fish out of the water to give him some money, is able to calm the storms, is able to turn water into wine, is able to walk on the water, is able to refer to someone being able to put their net on the other side and to get a bunch of fish. This human being has authority over the chaotic waters. Number nine, the name of this promised Messiah will pre-exist the sun in the sky. Not the Messiah himself pre-existing, but his own name is going to pre-exist in God's plans and God's purposes. And number 10, this human ruler is going to function as the judge, vindicating and administering justice on behalf of God as God's human agent. So, this promised Jewish Messiah is not a mere man. He is a highly qualified, highly empowered human being who rules on Yahweh's behalf. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Please join us next week as we examine the cardinal number 1 in Hebrew, the word echad, and we're going to see if what people say is actually true, which is that echad supposedly is a plural word, a word meaning compound one. Is this actually the case? Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube or iTunes, by giving us an honest review online, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends on social media. That really helps us. If you'd like to throw us a few dollars, you can check out the episode's description for a PayPal link, or you can subscribe with one of two subscription monthly options on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.